Hello, I'm Anke Corbin, the co-founder and CEO of Globig. I want to welcome you to an introduction to going global from a cultural perspective. And my expert guest today is Sabine Amend. And Sabine is the president and CEO of TI Communication USA. And TI Communication is really a leader in global culture training. Sabine, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today and just providing your insights and expertise on culture for this series that we want to do here.
Well, thanks, Anke, for welcoming me. It's a pleasure being in these conversations with you that we've had for a while now, and your enthusiasm for this topic has just been infectious. So I'm very excited to be sharing some information today with you and with whoever may be interested in this topic.
It's such a good one. It's one of my favorites, as you know, and I know we've talked several times about, I think it's so overlooked too, right? So having the awareness of and being able to manage effectively within any given country and understanding the culture and the people. And it's just often overlooked as probably, I think, one of the most important variables in the success or failure when companies expand globally. So our goal with this training here is really to just lay the foundation so that companies can be much more successful when they do international business or when they work with international coworkers and employees around the world. So we want to share a little bit about this, kind of this topic, and I'm going to say it's really something that you provided, and this is the framework of 5 factors. So let's have you go through that, and let's jump right on in and talk a little bit about what it is that we're going to talk about and give everyone a sense of what this conversation is all about.
So this is a 5-factor framework, and awareness is really at the beginning of it because it's really the beginning of a journey. If you aren't aware that culture is an enormously influential factor, you're not going to take any action on it. So that's where it has to start, with awareness. Once you have some awareness, you're probably in a good place to seek out information. You realize, oh, there's things that would really help us if we knew. You then start moving into, wait a minute, we need to communicate. So the question of languages, multiple languages and styles start coming in, which often takes you into, oh, who do we have in our organization who actually has the right skills to execute our strategy? And then you're probably finding there are some gaps or there are some learning needs. So that's the development strategy. And as you go on to your journey, you realize this global business journey that you're on needs to change your organization in many ways. And you need to develop that deep dexterity, that your whole organization is geared towards global mindedness and a particular type of flexibility that's capable of looking at business through multiple lenses from multiple cultures and places and practices. So that's the framework, and today we'll only focus on the awareness.
Where do you start? Where do you start? How does one become aware, if you will, and what are you supposed to be aware of?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Oftentimes it's the hardest one too, because when we're not aware, we're just not seeing it. I mean, I can give you an example how I often see that clients may not be aware, and it's their use of language, which would be, well, business people just do business. It's the same the world over. What's there to learn? That's a pretty good signal that awareness is not there. The awareness is about, wait a minute, yes, we do business, and how we do business, how we think about it, how we communicate with each other, how we form relationships, and how do we get to productivity. That can vary very, very significantly depending on where you're in the world and who you're doing business with. And that is layered with a whole lot of other factors, such as legal systems and market conditions and so on. So you end up having to deal with a whole set of new variables that you may not have needed to consider up to this point. So that's awareness. The first part is really, there's something we need to pay attention to, and that will be influential. And sometimes that awareness happens through the school of hard knocks, where you get some
failure,
feedback
right?
that's failure, or feedback that's less than pleasant. Say you hold a presentation and it's worked really well for you in this style in the US, and suddenly you really fall flat on your face and you go, whoa, what just happened?
Right.
And you're left with a feeling of, this was awkward, I was not effective, and actually I have no clue why, other than it didn't work. That can be an awareness-raising moment, some unexpected feedback.
Right.
Other times it can be courageous colleagues or friends who say, you know, what you're doing here isn't really working so well. You're lucky when you have colleagues or friends from a different culture or with more experience who are willing to speak up. For me, one of those examples was in South Africa. I was in a very engaged conversation with a woman there, and me being German, I make intensive eye contact when I get excited and engaged. And then she disappeared on me at this meeting, and I didn't know why. And in the evening, she said, look, the way you stare at me when you talk to me is really uncomfortable for me, and in our culture, we don't do that. And I went red in my face. I was so embarrassed because I wanted to engage with her, and I really found her intriguing, and instead I made her really uncomfortable. But without her feedback, I would have never known. So it's often these things where you don't know what you don't know, and I could have stayed clueless without her feedback and help.
Right, and that's really helpful. And like you said, that's a gift when someone's willing to share feedback like that. But that's pretty rare that that happens unless it's maybe a managerial position where their role is to try to help you get better and they're willing to provide that feedback. But most of the time, you just are less effective than you would like to be.
Yeah, and often it slips by. You don't even notice what you're leaving on the table because you're lacking the awareness between the state you're in right now and what optimal impact or performance could be. You just don't know how else it could be.
Right. Now when you work with clients, you have tools and you have processes that you go through, and I know that you want to share some of that information. And one of these things is this framework, if you will. Tell us a little bit about, how can companies approach this? What are some ways to really think about this?
Yeah, so this framework is something that's been around for quite a while, and it's not something that I have personally invented, but it is a very useful framework to understand how we know. When it's about, I know what I know, that's the stuff we know we've learned in school, for example. I know how to do an ROI calculation, or I know for me personally that my Mandarin language skills are pretty solid. Or you may know that you know the material science for your engineering that you do at your company. You know that you know and what you know, and you can talk about it pretty easily. You also know what you don't know and can speak about it. You might know that you do not speak any Mandarin, or I know that I don't have the first idea about Arabic grammar, or I know that I haven't got a clue about quantum physics. I'm quite clear about that. So these are the pretty easy areas. Where it gets much trickier is the part in white in our bottom quadrants. How can it be that I don't know what I do not know, for example? And this is our blind spots. This is often, for example, where we haven't lived outside of our culture of origin, and we don't know that there are people who see life completely differently from ourselves. We just haven't come across that, and we've not needed to know. We've never considered it. So we assume that it's all the same, except that assumption is drastically incorrect. Or say I were to start studying astrophysics. Right now, I have no idea how vast the field is that I would get into. There's so much I don't know that I don't know.
Yeah.
And the other part on the right-hand side is, I do not know that I know. Now, how is that possible? If we know things, don't we know? But this is where often your home culture, your culture of origin lives. You've learned stuff so early in your life. You've made it so much part of your normal way of looking at the world that it is unconscious. It's kind of your autopilot software that takes you through life.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a consistent lens of thinking and behaving and seeing patterns that you're not aware that you're actually running what one of the cultural scholars calls the software of your mind. And until and unless, again, somebody challenges you into why do you do things that way, or ask some strange questions, or you start colliding with somebody else, you don't know that you're running that programming. It works fabulously. You know how to behave. Everybody seems sort of similar. So you don't know.
Right.
It just works.
You know, this is especially, I've heard something when you have island cultures. So islands of whether they're physical islands or they've been closed off of a lot of other cultures, or they have very, very little diversity or very, very little input from other cultures. And you see this in China, you see this in Japan, you see this somewhat in, you know, like some of the northern islands. They've just got so much inherent culture and so much knowledge that they don't even know that they know, and everyone knows those same things, that they don't have to talk about them or share them. But as soon as someone else comes in, they have absolutely, it's not even something that they can train them on or make them aware of, because they don't even know that everyone knows this, right?
Yeah, and often it's so implicit. I mean, these are things you may carry like in a physical way of knowing. Like, I can't explain to you anymore how I've learned eye contact German style.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or somebody else could probably not articulate what the Japanese patterns of sensitivity and empathy to other people really are. It's like you feel it or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
But it's incredibly difficult to put into words. It's just the stuff where we often say, well, it just is, or it's just common sense, or what a stupid question, what is there to explain? These are good indicators that there is material that's about, I actually don't know that, or how specifically I know something.
Would you say that people have become really aware? You know, the US is somewhat unaware of cultural differences and that sort of thing. But it almost seems like I've had a lot more conversations with people recently because of the polarizing political landscape and this lack of awareness that there are people that think differently than they might. And there's just this, I had no idea, and it would have never occurred to me. And it's almost like a cultural shock, if you will, for them. And it's like the first time I think that there's this awareness that that everyone isn't exactly the same, or that we don't all think the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And when we become aware of difference, that's for most human beings quite uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes sincerely disturbing. It's not an easy process for us emotionally to realize, oh, the universe that I took for granted, the outlook that I assumed was shared, is actually not shared. I'm not in this world that all sees things the same way. It's uncomfortable, it's challenging, and it takes a while to really develop, if you will, the relationship muscle to be able to bridge into those differences and to go, okay, if I can't take this for granted, how do I now relate to the world, to myself, to other people? And it is challenging for human beings to wrestle with that.
Absolutely.
And some people don't want to. They just withdraw into their small bubbles and go, I'm just not going to deal with this discomfort and this confusion. It's just too much. And that is also a choice.
Yeah, as you had mentioned before, oftentimes awareness, going back to what we're thinking about, is really you become aware because of a problem or some sort of traumatic event, and that same thing happens internationally or with a different culture, right? Typically it's not this pleasant learning experience that we all hope it could be.
No, typically it's not. I know that my early international living experiences had a lot to do about feeling embarrassed or awkward a lot of the time. Where it's like, oh, this is kind of a rocky ride. And in this regard, I love working with people in this line of work because we can make this ride a little smoother, a little faster, a little less painful for the people we work with. It doesn't all have to be the school of hard knocks. There'll be enough situations that are puzzling, but it doesn't have to be like that all the way.
Which is really helpful to know. I want to make sure I don't move us out, because I know we have several things within this situation as well here. But I've just moved us into the next graph here.
Yeah. So when you take the sort of 4 quadrants and we layer in kind of what we just addressed and the whole piece of how does this awareness piece relate to being really culturally savvy. So basically your cultural blind spot is in your bottom left corner, where you don't know what you don't know. That's your cultural blind spot, where there's just stuff about other cultures that you're clueless about, and that's okay. There will always be something that you're clueless about. That's okay. And the other part is your unconscious cultural patterns, where it's like, oh, I didn't know that was an American thing. I thought that was just normal. Mm-hmm. Or I didn't know that was a Chinese thing. I thought that was just normal. These are the unconscious cultural patterns where we just think it's everybody's normal, and we then discover it's not. It's actually unique to our area or region or culture. So the question is, how do we move forward? And often when we find out a cultural blind spot, that takes us into, I know that I don't know. That's kind of that awkward moment where it's like, oh, I guess I was clueless. We often don't feel exactly brilliant in that moment, but it's a very, very useful moment in our learning journey because we just made a huge leap in awareness. And that leap often triggers us then to move over to the left, which is do some research and start learning more. So that's a really constructive part of the journey. But without kind of that moment of, oh, I don't know, we don't build awareness and we don't build knowledge. So that's kind of the journey very often. Often also, of course, as we realize we have a blind spot or that we have an uncultural cultural pattern, these inform each other. That we realize, oh, if I don't know something about them, then, oh, there might be stuff I don't know about myself. So sometimes that's a sideways movement too when we get to this moment of, ooh, awkward, don't know. But that's also really productive because as we grow in our cultural savvy at both parts, that other awareness and that self-awareness both need to grow, because I need to understand what unique cultural pieces I bring into my relationships. And then the reactions that others may have become less surprising when I can maybe understand why they think I'm strange or weird or currently not so appropriate in my behavior.
Or less effective as a manager or someone that they may not want to work with on the extreme side, right? Right.
Yeah. Or why they go, man, working with Sabine in certain ways is really hard. And I go like, what? I'm just being me. And they go like, roll their eyes and go, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So with building cultural savvy, I just talked about the sort of processes, these shifts between those quadrants. And one of the pieces that's really important to keep in mind is that building your cultural savvy is not a one-time event. I mean, your awareness may be triggered by a one-time event, but getting more skillful, more savvy, more aware, that's really a learning process over time, and one that you can really cultivate. Our goal is that our blind spots and our uncultural patterns, those areas keep shrinking and shrinking. They'll never go away totally. We do, however, get to manage them increasingly effectively and increasingly consciously and increasingly through more effective strategies in communicating. But what that takes on that journey is really setting an intention and sticking with it. It takes courage, because making yourself a fool and learning from it, that takes courage. Mm-hmm. It also takes a willingness to stay in inquiry rather than to go like, oh yeah, those other people are just difficult idiots. And believe me, that's sometimes my internal talk. And then I go, okay, maybe not an ideal learning behavior. What good questions could you ask, or what could you reflect on instead? And this is refocusing when we get judgmental, and we all do, towards good questions, towards getting curious again, and resetting that willingness to actually learn from those irritations. And again, we don't always succeed, but we have to stick with it if we want to grow. And it's flexibility. It's like, okay, if my one way or my preferred way of learning and doing things doesn't work, am I willing to try something else? Am I willing to flex my behavior? Am I willing to flex into a new idea? Am I willing to listen to somebody in a new way and see the potential and the possibility there? So that's kind of a lot of courage, curiosity, and flexibility muscles in ourselves, and that we really need to train. And like any kind of training, be it growing new brain structures or new muscles, these are processes that thrive through feedback, repetition, and practice over time. I mean, you're not going to run a marathon with a day's worth of training. You do that building and building and building until you're ready. And this is similar. It's really a practice process.
Is there something that companies can do to assess whether someone is really going to be able to do this? Because it almost seems like maybe even the higher up you get in a company, or the more, the longer you've been doing something, sometimes the less flexible you are. Is that true, or is that really independent of that, and that people either learn flexibility or are flexible versus others might not be at every level?
Well, I see that there is a certain aspect of personality structure. I mean, some people have a much easier time with flexibility than others. Flexibility often also is in an inverse relationship to stress level. And often at very senior roles, stress levels are quite high. So one of the big connections there is, if you want to be on that learning journey and foster your flexibility, figuring out how to manage your stress levels is a really critical component. And I really believe there is a connection there, why sometimes senior executives, with the workload and the stress load they have, find the way into flexibility a little harder, because they're already maxed out in terms of attention and stress and everything else.
So I know in my own personal life that when I'm busy, when I'm stressed, I don't take the time to slow down enough to evaluate, to think that maybe it's not them, or that it could be a cultural issue, or that I am just not aware and understanding. I think we just all get to where we're so busy that we don't take the time to do that. Right?
Exactly. And our brain literally shuts down into a just survival mode. And when we're there, we think in black and white. We don't do nuance anymore. We don't do possibility anymore. We just do yes or no, get through the day.
I just survive.
And that's all. to survive. And I mean, that's useful some of the time because it gets us doing stuff quickly. And if we do that all the time, we actually make ourselves relatively blind, and we reduce our capacity to discover things, to see options, and to flex our thinking and behaviors. That's where we become reduced. So too much pressure all the time is actually a real limitation.
I mean, it's kind of a reality, though, that we all live in, right? So what can an executive do, a manager do, someone where they know that they're not succeeding or their team isn't succeeding enough? What can they do? What are some of the things, other than taking a vacation, I suppose, but, some tactical things that might really help?
Well, I have these conversations a lot about, I don't have time for this, and yet I see the point. What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of my points on this may seem really simple, yet they've really worked. Some of it is the literal, like, take 3 deep breaths now.
Right.
And just count to 10 before you respond to whatever was the first thing that was about to come out of your mouth.
Great advice. Great advice.
Another one is if you feel yourself getting irritable or judgmental, again, take a breath and go like, is there a question here that I could ask instead of whatever probably slightly snide comment is trying to come out?
Right.
The other part is, are there like mini times to just regroup that you can build into your day? I mean, this is work that I've just done with somebody, and he's designated a quiet, let's just step back from whatever I'm doing zone physically in his office. So he has an agreement with himself that he will get off his desk and just stand in a certain corner in his space, look out of the window, and just pause for a couple of minutes and go like, what am I really thinking here? Before he will get back and whatever, answer that email, do that phone call, or make that decision. So he's organized his space physically so that he gives himself that space as his thinking and let's stop for a moment zone. And again, that doesn't take time. I mean, it's a minute or two, and we all have that if we make this a decision to work on this.
What you're sharing sounds very similar, but with a cultural perspective and with more specific around someone coming from a different place, to mindfulness, right? To some of the practices that I've heard around that. Have you heard that before? Or?
Yeah, there is certainly overlap. If somebody has established mindfulness practices in their lives, they're very applicable. Mm-hmm. I tend to just use a very pragmatic language because a lot of this stuff is really simple practices that we have a great capacity to forget that we can actually use them. Right. So remembering that we can do this is really a big part of the practice, and that does the trick. We know this. This is not rocket science, and yet we forget to do it. And the skill is in the doing and in the, oh yeah, I have an option here. I don't have to just get reactive. That's where the skill is.
Yeah. One of the things that you shared with me, it was a set of questions, if you will, and they were around culture, and I think you had called it the culture questions paradigm.
Yeah.
And I know that we have that as a resource, and we can certainly share that, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that derail our processes, and then let's go through some of the questions and that you might be able to ask to kind of bring that back.
Sure. And I mean, one of the ways to maybe remind ourselves that practice here matters is when we think about well, what can it cost us if we don't foster awareness? I mean, it may be fairly simple misunderstandings, like the embarrassment of a presentation that doesn't go well. But it could also be a fairly significant impact, and that would be the failure of communication and the soured relationships and the poor reputation. For example, like the failed Daimler-Chrysler merger. I mean, there were so many both German, US, American cultural disconnects as well as organization culture disconnects that essentially that was one of the biggest destructions of market capitalization we've seen in industrial history. And the success rates overall of international mergers and acquisitions continue to be terrible, like failure rates of around 70%. I mean, if you need a reminder that this matters, that might help. It's like, whoa, that could be very, very costly. And depending on how large your organization is, that could put us out of business.
Absolutely. I see that in even intra-company country mergers and acquisitions. That failure rate is probably not any better, but I imagine there's another layer of complexity when you're talking international, because they're just, and the time and the effort is just not put where it needs to be. It's only in the numbers, right? Those relationships make sense. They should strategically be an amazing fit, and then they completely fall apart. So
yeah, because in the end, you have to have people doing the work together. And if they don't do the work together, the work isn't going to get done. And you're destroying enormous amounts of value. You're destroying, of course, the knowledge in the company, because your key players, your best players will leave first, and they will leave quickly. You might lose market position because you're not serving your clients the way they should be. So they get alienated, and you may not understand your clients in that new country. So that's another piece that you really sour those relationships. You might invest in certain activities that really don't gain traction because you don't know about the cultural components to them that would make them effective. So you're sinking money there. And again, I mean, I see that a lot, especially with expatriate leaders. They're ineffective in their leadership and in their decision making, and they don't get good work out of their teams, and also may make decisions that stay costly in terms of engagement, in terms of just investments, in terms of time to market for a long time.
Yeah, you hear it. There's so many. I mean, the interesting thing is there's no lack of case studies of seeing this. It's everywhere and constant, but it's really unfortunate, because if they just would take this more serious and have a cultural plan, I think that the intent of that would already make such a big difference, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, have a plan and work at least some of it would make a huge difference. And again, without awareness, that door has to open, because without awareness, there's not ever going to be that step towards plans. And so often in clients, say organizations, I see the people who initiate the learning have already had a failure or a challenge. And it's whoever that is. I mean, sometimes it's line managers that had a really tough time in an international project who go, we have to change this. And they just go after their HR department and pester them until they go like, it's easier to do this than to resist you. Other times you might have a senior manager that for family reasons or professional reasons has lived in a couple of countries and already had a learning curve and now sees how that applies to whatever the organization is trying to do. And that might be a person who pushes the organization forward because they also have a healthy understanding of the risks of not attending to this and go like, that extra day of a workshop or that extra week of doing added research or this moment of having a few more conversations with in-country partners, or to take that one extra on-the-ground trip to build relationships, this is all small fry compared to what issues we can really prevent for the overall endeavor that we're in. Because a lot of these things, they're not huge investments, but if they're not taken, they can have a very, very significant financial and performance impact.
Yeah, we were sharing some of the things that we see, right? It's just that, you know, if you get to the point, it's okay if you have a misunderstanding or two, and it's okay every once in a while if there's some communication. So maybe the project doesn't get done as quickly or as whatever. What happens when it gets more extreme is that those relationships are not redeemable, and you no longer are someone that they want to work with anymore. And there's just this complete shut off of people responding, and you know, so all of a sudden everything that's being done is considered a failure. And I think we've all seen versions of that in our own interactions with people, right? So one day everything you do is fantastic and it's really great, and then through all these things of chipping away, you know, that just becomes to a point where there isn't this relationship anymore.
Yeah, and others hear about that too. So it might be that you're really damaging your potential in your industry as well. When you start being positioned as somebody who is not good to work with, you will miss out on so many opportunities to get top suppliers or excellent clients or build more alliances. You really, really limit the horizon of opportunity for yourself. You really, really create yourself difficulties with further growth.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about some of those, some action items. Let's talk about the culture questions, you know, some of the things that you might be able to ask. I know that we'll share a resource that you have, which has a number of questions, but I'd love to go through just a few of those so people can understand how they might, kind of like you said, it's a paradigm shift, right? It's taking yourself through this, and you have to get to where maybe you keep it on your desktop for a while, and just like every time there's a situation, you go through some of these questions, and after a while, maybe they become more natural.
Yeah. Yeah, and when something shows up that is surprising or irritating, there's some good questions to ask yourself. For example, what might I not know about this person and their culture? Or even, how might their behavior be influenced by a cultural factor? Maybe they're not a difficult person. Maybe there is a cultural piece here. Just to ask yourself, what might be a cultural piece here that I haven't recognized? Also, the other way around, what might my counterpart not know about my culture that could be confusing or just unfamiliar and influence their reactions?
And just clarity in those expectations, right? Especially when you're just starting. You know, you've mentioned that presentation that might not have gone well, but had everyone talked about what a good presentation looks like and what everyone is expecting and how much time everyone thinks should be put into this and the sort of data that they need to present, then the likelihood of that having been successful would be a lot higher, especially early on, over communicating, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's an example of a great presentation in your company or your city or your country? Tell me about it, or send me one and say a few words, or is there a video that I could watch of a great presentation from your view? Could have helped that. And again, that doesn't take that much time, but it takes the understanding that's important to ask.
Right. And I think the appreciation will be there that you care enough to want to understand their culture and their expectations too.
Yeah, and that's a huge piece. If you ask questions that demonstrate that you care enough and that you're willing to learn, that in itself is a really useful piece of relationship building. That is like, oh, you're not just closed-minded and you don't want to know, you want to know. Oh, great. That makes such a difference. That sets difference. It sets a completely different tone.
Absolutely. What are some other questions you might be able to ask?
A good one is, which blind spots might we have in our organization? Like, what are we not seeing? And who could we ask that has a different perspective than ourselves, who might fill in those blind spots?
Right. I had a new
I mean,
boss one time, and he came in and he told us, so I'm going to be new and I'm going to be looking at things from my perspective, but if you were in my shoes and you would be taking this role, what are the things that you would consider priorities to address? What are the things that we do amazingly well today? And what are the things that, so it was in that, that need to be really a change because they're a big challenge. And the opportunity to share that and that input, and even if it wasn't taken or wasn't fully heard, or they have different perspectives by the time they done, the insights that that person would have received from those questions were pretty significant. And that same sort of thing, if you're going into a new place, and especially in a new culture, just, it's okay to say, I don't know your culture as well. You've been here. What would you do if you were me? Like, so that you at least get a sense of things that are really important to them.
Yeah, and invite people to tell stories, like, what's been a really great experience working in a team for you? Mm-hmm. What was that like? What made it great? You learn so much from questions like that. Or you've had a really effective, like, leader-follower relationship. What made that great? And come in. It's okay to not know. Not knowing is a completely okay state when you work internationally, because frankly, there's a lot that you do not know and that you cannot know, especially at the beginning. So that's
true.
Okay.
But we all make these assumptions and we all have these stereotypes, if you will. Like, what are some that you've run into stereotypes from different countries and people just assume about? And I know they're really there and we all have them, but.
Oh yeah. I mean, for one of the really tricky ones is, when everybody speaks English, they must be thinking the same way. That's a really dangerous assumption.
Right.
That's rarely the case. Another one, a stereotype that a lot of people around the world hold towards U.S. Americans is U.S. Americans know nothing about the wider world and they don't care. They're just, in that regard, both ignorant and arrogant. And that's another piece why some awareness and some willingness to learn is so important, because with that you immediately break that stereotype and you break down a major wall. And then you can actually get to work.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just so important. How we manage these biases. I mean, I know we all have them. So we've talked through some of those questions. What are some other things that someone can do from a company perspective, tactical things? And then, obviously we want to have some sort of call to action and figure out, how we can help people.
I mean, tactical things, some are just really small things in your own life. Rent a movie that was produced in another country and watch it in that language with subtitles that you can read. And just observe how differently a story can be told, or how the visual language might be different, or the moral of the story might not be what you expect. Or look at your neighborhood and go, like, where are there people who are actually different from my own cultural background, and how can I hang out and just have a conversation and just get curious and go, like, what do you enjoy about life? What's important to you? Mm-hmm. And just get involved in that mindset of curiosity and finding out more. There's so many ways to expand your universe, even in your, like, very daily environments. Or, I mean, in your own organizations, I mean, what I notice, most organizations don't even see that they're already internally culturally diverse. I mean, look around and go like, what do I actually know about my colleagues? Who of them might be a first generation American? In many organizations, there are many. And just say, hey, can we go to lunch? I never asked you about how you got here and what it was like transitioning into living and succeeding in this country. And just listen.
Right.
Because in most organizations I work, the newcomers are very, very conscious that they are expected to adapt and to fit in, and they're very careful to do that. And that actually silences a lot of knowledge in those organizations. And this is something you can draw on. That's a huge resource you probably already have.
That's great advice. I never thought about that. I'm always surprised even about, so I'm an immigrant as you are, and there are things about my day-to-day and my reactions to things that surprise me when in fact they shouldn't, because then I become aware that there's still cultural awareness even about myself and the things that I didn't even know that I knew, or the approaches that I would take that are not typical, and people are surprised, and those even surprise me. So nevertheless, if I look at others and that are even totally different cultures from mine.
Yeah, and really just practice having those conversations. That's a thing you can do fairly easily. And it's huge for an organization to build that capacity to just be genuinely curious and to practice talking and learning about cultural differences, and to make that okay, and to become more and more skillful. And it's just something you talk about as a normal part of this is part of doing business. That's a huge skill, because then when you get nervous, maybe with somebody who you don't know or at a higher stake situation, you already have that capacity to go, I could just ask that person a question and not kind of get all internally tense and just worry myself silly and then just take some action that I hope is going to be okay.
I think that's great. You have a couple of resources here that I think would be helpful to just do a quick recap on that. It's a great place for people to start. And then what are some of the things that you can do with people if they want to continue to learn and get more information from here?
Well, I think one useful practice is know where you are now. So that's the whole realm of assess. I mean, we have a very simple, and that's a free, sort of quick and dirty organizational level assessment that just gives you a rough sketch of, okay, this is where we are and this is what we could do based on that assessment. There are some really good, fuller individual assessments for leaders, so that could be very interesting. Do you actually have the current leadership capacity to do what you need to do? And based on those assessments, to do some really focused development, that's very useful. If an area you feel you really need some kickstarting, I mean, a quick webinar on global intelligence or one particular culture is a really nice way to just get some awareness going and to feed your thinking, go like, never thought of that. Yeah. It's a really practical way. We have a little video that we use, which is an interview with one of the very successful global CEOs, the CEO of Nissan and Renault, who did phenomenal work worldwide. And hearing him speak about how he thinks about his work is inspiring and informational in terms of this is the attitude as well as the thought process of somebody who does this work really well on the global scale. And of course, there's research, literature, and readings. I mean, one of the really good books is Nancy Adler's International Dimensions of Organizational Behavior, and that first part is the most effective way. There's way more information than you need, but focus on part one. That'll be a good start.
Well, and we'll share all these resources with everyone. There'll be a blog write-up that supports this video webcast so that everyone can get all of that information.
Yeah. And do something. I mean, TI Communication has a whole series of webinars. They're usually a 90-minute format, so that's an easy way to just put your toe in and just get some momentum. If you feel you need to bring a leadership team together around, okay, do we have awareness? Do we have alignment? Do we understand what we know and don't know? These are stuff that themes that can be workshopped really well in a day with some facilitation, some guidance. Things you probably want to do as well is if you know you have employees that are like critical communicators in your international endeavors, and you know which cultures they interact with, give them some training. Mm-hmm. Again, this is not a huge investment, and it's going to make such a difference. It's going to increase the engagement of these employees and their counterparts. It's going to save you time and money and frustration in a really major way. You'll just get stuff done, and it's just not going to hurt as bad.
That's fantastic. Sabine, I want to thank you so very much for sharing really a lot about awareness and just culture in general, and how to tactically make a difference and where companies can start. So we're going to share Sabine's information, and please reach out. They have a lot of fantastic resources. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, and there's obviously different levels, but again, thank you so much for joining us today. We absolutely look forward to having you here on another training session, Sabine. Thanks again.
Thank you, Anke. Thank you for having us. And again, just love your enthusiasm and your experience in the field. So thank you.
You too.